Do as I said, or quit. The CEO didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 40 supervisors were watching through the glass. Everyone knew what that sentence meant. Marcus Ellison looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he reached into his pocket and pressed stop on the voice recorder app that had been running since the meeting began. He closed his laptop, stood up, packed his bag, and walked out. The factory thought he had just ruined his life. What they didn't know was that he had just started something far bigger. Real quick, before this story goes any further, if nobody told you about this channel, somebody should have. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this right now? I want to see how far this reaches. All right, let's get back to it. The plant floor at Meridian Industrial started its day at 6:15, and Marcus Ellison was always there by 5:40. Not because anyone required it, because the shift change happened at 6, and the first 15 minutes told him more about the state of operations than any report ever could. Which supervisors arrived early, which ones were running on fumes, whether the night crew had left the floor clean or left their problems for someone else to find. He walked the perimeter every morning, same route, past the stamping presses, through the assembly corridor, along the loading dock, back through quality control. He didn't carry a clipboard on these walks. He carried his eyes and his memory. He knew what normal looked like, and he knew what drift looked like, and he had spent 11 years learning the difference. The floor workers called him Mr. Ellison to his face. Behind his back, they called him the conveyor belt. Not because he was mechanical, because he was the thing that kept everything moving at the same speed, without variation, without surprise. You could set your watch by him. You could set your safety on him. He had stopped 2 line shutdowns in the past year by catching maintenance shortcuts before they became incidents. He had rewritten the lockout-tagout procedures after a near miss that the previous operations director had classified as operator error and buried. Marcus had reclassified it as system failure, retrained the entire shift, and posted the new protocols in 3 languages, because 40% of his workforce didn't have English as a first language, and he wasn't interested in protecting anyone's comfort at the expense of someone else's fingers. He was not popular with middle management. He was something more useful than popular. He was trusted. That trust was about to become a problem. The federal safety audit had arrived on a Tuesday in March. Marcus had known it was coming. Audits always came with a paper trail of scheduling notices and compliance confirmations. What he hadn't known, what nobody at the plant level had known, was that the audit would find what it found. 14 violations. 3 of them serious enough to trigger a compliance order. A compliance order meant a shutdown. Not a suggestion, not a timeline for corrective action. A shutdown. 6 weeks minimum, according to the regulatory framework. Possibly 8, depending on how long the reinspection process took. 6 weeks of shutdown at a plant this size meant $4 million in lost revenue per week. It meant 800 workers sent home without pay. It meant contracts defaulted, clients lost, market positions surrendered to competitors who were already circling. Marcus read the audit report in his office with the door closed. He read it twice. He set it down on his desk and looked at the wall. The violations were real. He wasn't going to pretend they weren't. The ventilation system in the paint shop was operating below required airflow. The emergency exit in the east corridor had been partially blocked by pallet storage for at least 3 months. The pressure valves on 2 of the hydraulic presses were overdue for certification by 11 weeks. These were not gray areas. These were failures. And Marcus had inherited most of them from the previous director, who had inherited them from the one before that. The plant had been running on deferred maintenance and optimistic record-keeping for years, and the bill had finally arrived. He wrote a corrective action plan. He costed it out. He submitted it to corporate within 72 hours, because that was the kind of man he was. Corporate did not respond for 9 days. When they did, the response came not from the operations division, but from the CEO's office directly. Evelyn Grant wanted to see him. Evelyn Grant had run Meridian Industrial for 6 years. She had come up through finance, not operations. And she understood numbers the way Marcus understood floors. Not as abstractions, but as living systems that told you the truth if you knew how to read them. She was not cruel. She was not reckless. She was a woman who had been given a company with declining margins and rising costs, and who had kept it alive through a combination of aggressive negotiation, strategic cost-cutting, and an unwavering belief that survival was its own form of virtue. She had never visited the plant before this week. Marcus noticed that. He noticed that she walked through the floor with the particular alertness of someone who was seeing a thing for the first time and was surprised by what she found. She shook hands. She asked questions. She did not pretend to know the names of the machines. Then they went to her office. She sat behind her desk. He sat across from her. The audit report was between them like a third presence. 14 violations, she said. Yes. 3 serious enough for a compliance order. Yes. And your corrective action plan estimates 6 weeks of shutdown. 6 to 8, Marcus said, depending on the reinspection timeline. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if we didn't shut down?" Marcus looked at her. "You can't pass reinspection without correcting the violations." "I'm not talking about passing reinspection." She paused. "I'm talking about not needing one." The room was very quiet. "You're talking about backdating compliance certifications," Marcus said. "I'm talking about avoiding an unnecessary shutdown that would put 800 people out of work. Those certifications would be falsified. Those certifications would be administrative corrections to documentation that doesn't reflect the actual state of the equipment. The actual state of the equipment is out of compliance. The actual state of the equipment is functional," Evelyn said. Her voice was level, precise. "The ventilation system is operating below optimal airflow. It's not inoperative. The exit is partially blocked. It's not sealed. The pressure valves are overdue for certification. They're not failed. We're talking about paperwork, Marcus. We're talking about the gap between functional and documented." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He had been in management long enough to recognize what was happening. This was not a woman who had decided to commit fraud. This was a woman who had decided that fraud and pragmatism were the same thing, and who was now recruiting someone to help her maintain that belief. "I'm not going to do that," he said. Evelyn didn't react immediately. She studied him with the same careful attention she had given the plant floor. "You understand what a shutdown means," she said. "Not just for the company, for the people on that floor, the ones who trust you. I understand what a compliance order means if we falsify federal documentation and someone gets hurt. No one is going to get hurt. You don't know that. I know that 800 families are going to lose their income because of paperwork." "It's not paperwork," Marcus said. "It's the reason the paperwork exists." Evelyn stood up. She walked to the window. The parking lot was visible below, half filled with the cars of the day shift. "I'm not asking you to compromise safety," she said, still facing the window. "I'm asking you to exercise judgment." "My judgment says no." She turned around. "Then I'll find someone whose judgment says yes." Marcus stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at her with an expression that was not anger and not fear and not defiance. It was something quieter than all of those. It was the expression of a man who had already decided what he was willing to carry and what he wasn't. "Some orders aren't meant to be debated," he said. "They're meant to be declined." He walked to the door. "Marcus," Evelyn's voice stopped him. Not because it was loud, because it was final. "If you walk out of this office, you don't come back." He opened the door. "I know," he said. He walked through the corridor. He took the elevator to the ground floor. He walked across the plant floor toward his office, and 40 supervisors watched him through the glass, and he knew what they were thinking. He knew what the story would be by the end of the shift. The conveyor belt had finally broken. The man who never bent had finally been broken. He reached into his pocket and pressed stop on the voice recorder app that had been running since the meeting began. He closed his laptop, stood up, packed his bag, and walked out. The factory thought he had just ruined his life. What they didn't know was that he had just started something far bigger. The story the plant told about Marcus Ellison was simple. He had cracked under pressure. He had been given a choice between loyalty and principle, and he had chosen principle, which everyone quietly agreed was the luxury of someone who didn't have a mortgage. The floor workers said it with a kind of resigned sympathy. Good man, bad timing. The way people talk about someone who has done a brave thing at the wrong moment. The supervisors were less generous. They said he had abandoned his team, left them holding a problem he helped create. Within 48 hours, a man named Dale Simmons had been promoted from shift manager to interim operations director. Dale was competent, agreeable, and understood implicitly that his job security was connected to his willingness not to ask certain questions. Within 2 weeks, the compliance certifications had been amended. Within a month, the plant had passed its re-inspection. The floor went back to normal, or what Meridian Industrial had decided to call normal. Marcus watched none of this directly. He heard it through the handful of workers who still texted him. Careful, brief messages that stopped just short of saying anything that could be traced. He read the compliance clearance announcement on the company's public news feed, a single paragraph buried beneath a quarterly earnings update. He saved the screenshot. The first month after leaving was the hardest logistically. He had savings, not the kind that made a person comfortable, but the kind that a man builds when he has raised a daughter alone for 8 years and has never once confused want with need. Enough to cover 3 months without panic. Enough to think, not just react. He filed for unemployment. He updated his resume. He took 2 phone screens for operations roles at mid-sized manufacturers and declined both before the second interview, not because the roles were beneath him, but because accepting them would require relocating, and Lila was 14 and in the middle of her freshman year, and there were things Marcus Ellison would not ask his daughter to absorb on his behalf. He set up a workspace in the second bedroom, a desk, a filing cabinet, a whiteboard. Lila called it the war room, not knowing how accurate she was. He started making files. Not immediately. The first few weeks, he did what he told himself was research. He pulled public OSHA records for Meridian's facilities. He cross-referenced incident reports with the compliance timelines he had personally overseen. He requested public documentation through regulatory databases that he knew existed because he had spent 11 years navigating them on the company's behalf. What he found was not a surprise. It was a pattern, and a pattern was different from a surprise. A pattern meant the thing had been happening long enough to leave a shape. Lila found him at the whiteboard on a Thursday evening in the second month. She was 14 in the way that some 14-year-olds are. Not childlike, not adult, but occupying a precise and uncomfortable strip of territory between the two, where she could see everything, but lacked the vocabulary to name most of it. She had her mother's ability to walk into a room and immediately identify the emotional temperature. She stood in the doorway of the war room and looked at the whiteboard. Dates, facility names, incident codes, regulatory filing numbers. She didn't ask what it was. She looked at her father. "You didn't just quit, did you?" she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus capped his marker. "No, you're building something. I'm documenting something. What's the difference?" He turned to face her. "Documentation is what you do before you decide what to build." Lila leaned against the doorframe. She had his jaw and her mother's eyes, and the combination produced an expression that was simultaneously skeptical and patient. "Are you going to be okay? Financially?" "No," she said. "Generally." Marcus looked at his daughter for a moment. She was asking whether the weight he was carrying was survivable. She had watched him carry things alone for 8 years, and she had developed an accurate sense of when the load was approaching the limit. "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to be okay." She nodded. She didn't fully believe him, but she accepted it, the way children accept the answers their parents give when the truth is something that needs more time. "Don't stay up too late," she said. She left him with the whiteboard. 6 weeks after Marcus walked out of Meridian, he sat across a conference table from a labor attorney named Sandra Osei. Sandra's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. Modest but precise. The kind of space that told you its occupant was serious without needing to perform it. She had spent 12 years in employment and regulatory law, and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from listening to a great many people describe injustice, and learning to distinguish the ones with cases from the ones with grievances. Marcus placed a folder on the table between them. Inside it, the audio recording from Evelyn Grant's office. 41 minutes and 17 seconds of unedited conversation. Sandra listened to the relevant portions without expression. When it was over, she looked at the folder, then at Marcus. "You were recording before she made the request," she said. "Yes." "Why?" Marcus had anticipated this question, "Because I had been documenting compliance irregularities for 4 months before that meeting, and I suspected the audit outcome was going to produce a conversation I needed a record of." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "That's a very deliberate answer. It's the accurate one." She looked at him carefully. "Mr. Ellison, I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Are you here because you want to sue the company for wrongful termination?" "I resigned," Marcus said, "technically. Under duress, there's a case. That's not why I'm here." Sandra set her pen down. "Then tell me why you're here." Marcus opened the folder to the second section. Not the audio. The documentation, 4 months of cross-referenced incident reports, compliance filing timelines, maintenance records obtained through public regulatory databases, and a specific pattern of contract labor utilization that he had flagged internally 3 times and been told each time to reclassify under a different cost center. He walked her through it in 20 minutes. He was organized and precise and did not editorialize. He let the documents carry their own weight. When he finished, Sandra looked at the table for a long moment. "This isn't a wrongful termination case," she said. "No," Marcus said. "This is a federal compliance and labor violation case. Potentially." "Potentially," she repeated. She looked at him. "You understand that if this goes federal, you don't control the outcome." "I understand that. The company could be shut down permanently, not 6 weeks, permanently. I understand that too. 800 jobs." Marcus held her gaze. "I know." The room was quiet, in the way that rooms get quiet when the weight of a thing has finally been named, and neither person in the room is ready to pretend it doesn't exist. "I'm not filing anything yet," Marcus said. "I want to understand what I have before I decide what to do with it. That's why I'm here." Sandra looked at the folder. She looked at him. She made the particular calculation that serious attorneys make when they recognize that the person across the table is not operating on emotion. "All right," she said. "Let's understand what you have." 3 months after Marcus left Meridian Industrial, a hydraulic press on Line 7 malfunctioned during a Tuesday afternoon shift. The pressure valve failed. Not catastrophically, not the way these things fail in worst-case scenarios, but enough. A 31-year-old assembly worker named Darnell Cooper caught the release of pressure on his left forearm. The burn was serious enough to require hospitalization. The fracture in his wrist required surgery. The incident report filed with OSHA listed the cause as operator error. Darnell Cooper had been running that press for 4 years without a single incident. The pressure valve that failed was the same category of valve that Marcus had flagged as overdue for certification in his corrective action plan. The same category that had been listed as compliant on the backdated documentation. Marcus received a text from a floor worker he trusted. 3 words. Line 7. Darnell. He sat at his desk in the war room and looked at the whiteboard. He added a line. He picked up his phone and called Sandra. "The pattern just became an incident," he said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. "I'll clear my schedule tomorrow morning," she said. Marcus hung up. He looked at the photograph on his desk. Lila at 12, laughing at something off camera, completely unburdened. He thought about Darnell Cooper in a hospital bed. He thought about the 41 minutes and 17 seconds sitting in a file on his encrypted hard drive. He thought about 800 families. He did not sleep well that night. He didn't expect to. The OSHA investigation into Darnell Cooper's injury lasted 11 days. Marcus watched it from the outside, the way you watch weather develop from behind glass. He read the public filings. He tracked the regulatory response timeline. He noted that the investigation was contained. Single incident, single facility, single cause classification, operator error. The same two words the company had used before. He noted something else. The investigation did not expand. That meant one of two things. Either the investigators had looked at the compliance documentation and found it satisfactory, or the compliance documentation had been presented in a way that made expansion seem unnecessary. Marcus knew which one it was. He added 3 more lines to the whiteboard. By month 4 of his unemployment, the war room had become something else entirely. It was no longer a space for research. It had become a repository of architecture, the kind of slow, deliberate structural mapping that Marcus had always done with operational systems, except now, the system he was mapping was the one that had been running underneath Meridian Industrial for years, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking at the right layer. The whiteboard had been replaced by a corkboard that covered most of the north wall. Index cards connected by colored thread. Not dramatic. Methodical. The kind of organization that comes from someone who has spent a career understanding that the difference between a safe plant and a dangerous one is almost never a single catastrophic decision. It's the accumulation of small ones, the deferred maintenance, the reclassified incident, the compliance window that gets pushed by 2 weeks, then 4, then quietly forgotten. He had identified 4 categories. The first was equipment certification gaps. Systematic delays in pressure valve, ventilation, and electrical certification across 3 of Meridian's 4 facilities. Not random delays, patterned ones, clustered around quarterly reporting periods, which suggested the delays were financially motivated, pushed to avoid the capital expenditure showing up in the quarter where it would hurt the most. The second was incident reclassification. 14 incidents over 3 years that had been initially logged as equipment-related and subsequently reclassified as operator error. Marcus had cross-referenced the incident logs with the equipment maintenance records. In 11 of the 14 cases, the equipment involved had a documented certification gap at the time of the incident. The third was contract labor utilization. Meridian used a rotating pool of contract workers, primarily sourced through a staffing agency called Consolidated Labor Solutions. The contract workers were disproportionately assigned to the highest risk positions on the floor: the stamping presses, the hydraulic lines, the paint shop ventilation areas, while permanent employees were clustered in lower risk supervisory and quality control roles. The contract workers had no access to the company's internal incident reporting system. Their injuries were logged separately, through the staffing agency, and did not appear in Meridian's OSHA filings. Marcus had spent 2 weeks obtaining the staffing agency's public insurance claim records through a regulatory database most people didn't know existed. He had cross-referenced them with Meridian's floor assignment logs, which he had retained copies of from his time as operations director because retaining operational documentation was standard practice and no one had thought to ask for it back when he left. The fourth category was the one that had kept him at the desk until 2 in the morning on 3 consecutive nights. The contract workers were 81% minority. The permanent employees in the lower risk roles were 67% white. This was not an accident. Marcus had run the numbers 6 different ways to make sure he wasn't finding a pattern that wasn't there. The assignment structure was too consistent across too long a period to be coincidence or individual supervisor bias. It was policy. Unwritten, unacknowledged, but policy. He stared at the corkboard. He thought about a word that carried legal weight: and institutional consequence, and that he had been careful not to use, even in his own notes, until he was certain. He wrote it on a single index card and pinned it in the center of the board. Insulation. The contract workers weren't just cheaper. They weren't just expendable in the accounting sense. They were positioned as the first layer of consequence. If something went wrong on line 7, the injury belonged to the staffing agency's insurance claim, not Meridian's OSHA record. The liability had been architected to flow away from the company and toward the people least equipped to redirect it. He sat back in his chair and looked at the word for a long time. 6 weeks after Darnell Cooper's injury, a story appeared in an industrial trade publication about a fire at a Meridian sister facility in Georgia. A chemical storage area. A ventilation failure that allowed solvent vapor to accumulate. No fatalities, but 3 workers hospitalized with respiratory injuries and 1 with burns covering 30% of his body. The story was 4 paragraphs. It ran once. It did not generate significant media attention. But it generated federal attention. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration opened a broader multi-facility inquiry into Meridian Industrial's compliance practices within 3 weeks of the Georgia incident. The inquiry was not announced publicly. Marcus learned about it through Sandra, who had contacts inside the regulatory community and who called him on a Wednesday morning with a specific kind of controlled urgency in her voice. "They're expanding the scope," she said. "All 4 facilities. Certification records, incident logs, labor classification practices." "Timeline?" Marcus asked. "Subpoenas within 60 days. Testimony within 90. Marcus looked at the corkboard. "All right." "Marcus," Sandra paused, "when they come to you, and they will come to you, you need to be ready for what you're handing them." "I've been ready. I mean, ready for what comes after," she said. "Not legally, personally." He understood what she meant. She meant the 800 jobs. She meant Darnell Cooper, who was back on light duty and needed the income. She meant the floor workers who had texted him in careful 3-word messages and who had mortgages and kids in school and no particular interest in being collateral damage in a federal investigation. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she asked. Not unkindly. "Because what you have is enough to shut that company down permanently. Not restructure it, not fine it, end it." "I know what I have." "Then make sure you know what you want to do with it," Sandra said. "Because once we hand it over, that decision is no longer yours." The subpoena arrived on a Tuesday morning. Lila was at school. Marcus was at his desk. The process server was professional and brief, and Marcus signed the acknowledgement without reading the cover letter first, because he had already read the draft version Sandra had anticipated and prepared him for. He set it on the desk next to his coffee. He looked at the corkboard. He thought about the 41 minutes and 17 seconds on his encrypted hard drive. He had not shared the recording with Sandra yet. He had told her it existed. He had not told her everything that was on it. Because the recording didn't just contain Evelyn Grant ordering him to falsify compliance certifications. It contained something else. Something he had not fully processed when he pressed stop and walked out of that office. Something he had been sitting with for 4 months, turning over and examining from different angles, trying to determine whether it changed what he was doing or simply changed how he understood it. He listened to the recording again that night. He sat at his desk with headphones in and a notepad in front of him. He had listened to it 4 times before. This was the 5th. Each time, he heard the same exchange. Each time, he stopped at the same moment. It was near the end, after the compliance conversation had run its course, and before Evelyn had delivered her ultimatum. A stretch of about 3 minutes that had not seemed significant in the room, because he had been focused on the documentation request. He had his pen uncapped and his notepad ready. He pressed play. Evelyn's voice, measured and precise. "You think this is about cutting corners. It's not. It's about what happens to this plant if we go dark for 6 weeks. I've run the projections. We don't come back from it. Not in this market. Not with the contracts we're holding. A pause. Then, quieter, almost to herself. Corporate gave us impossible targets. 18% margin improvement in a single fiscal year. On a plant this old, with this equipment, with these labor costs. I told them it wasn't achievable. I told them twice. They told me to find a way or find a replacement. Another pause. I found a way. I'm not proud of every part of it, but 800 people are still employed because I found a way. Marcus took the headphones off. He sat in the silence of the war room. He had been building a case against a woman who had backed him into a corner and issued an ultimatum that crossed a legal and ethical line. He had been building it carefully and deliberately, with the patience of a man who understood that the truth had more power when it was organized than when it was loud. But the 3 minutes at the end of the recording had complicated the architecture. Because Evelyn Grant was not a cartoon. She was a woman who had been handed an impossible equation by people above her and had solved it in ways that were wrong, but not for reasons that were simple. He didn't forgive her for it. He wasn't built for easy forgiveness. But he understood something now that he hadn't fully understood when he walked out of her office. She was also trapped. Not the way Marcus had been trapped. Not with the immediate weight of a falsification request and 40 supervisors watching through the glass. But trapped in the longer, slower way that institutions trap people. The way impossible targets become policy. The way policy becomes culture. The way culture becomes the thing everyone agrees not to look at directly. He looked at the corkboard. Insulation. The word looked different now. Not less true, just larger. The insulation wasn't just the contract workers absorbing liability on the floor. It was Evelyn absorbing pressure from corporate. It was Marcus being pushed out when he refused to be part of the buffer. Everyone in this system was someone else's insulation. He picked up his phone and called Sandra. I need to tell you something about the recording, he said. All right. There's more on it than I told you. Sandra was quiet for a moment. How much more? Enough to change the framing, he said. Not the facts. The framing. I'll come to you tomorrow morning, she said. Don't share it with anyone else until I've heard it. Marcus hung up. He looked at the corkboard one more time. He thought about Lila, asleep down the hall. He thought about Darnell Cooper's left forearm. He thought about the unnamed workers in the Georgia facility, with burns and damaged lungs and a 4-paragraph story that ran once. He thought about 800 families who had no idea their retirement security was sitting on a foundation that was about to be examined by federal investigators. He turned the light off. He didn't sleep. But this time, the insomnia had a different texture. Not the weight of what he was carrying, the weight of what he was about to decide. The request came through a secure email address. No subject line, just a date, a time, and a location. A private conference room at a downtown business center. No corporate branding. No Meridian letterhead. No lawyers. No recording. 20 minutes. Marcus read it twice. He didn't reply for 3 hours. He thought about the subpoena sitting on his desk. He thought about the 41 minutes and 17 seconds on his encrypted drive. He thought about what Sandra had told him. Once we hand it over, that decision is no longer yours. He typed a single word in response. Agreed. The conference room was on the 12th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a grid of wet streets and gray rooftops. The HVAC system hummed at a low, consistent frequency. There was a glass table, 2 chairs, a pitcher of water, and 2 empty glasses. Evelyn was already there when he walked in. She looked different. Not broken, just stripped of the armor she wore in boardrooms and on plant floors. Her hair was pulled back. Her blazer was unbuttoned. She wasn't checking her phone. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table, fingers interlaced, the posture of someone who had already decided to stop performing control. Marcus sat across from her. He didn't take out a notebook. He didn't reach for his phone. He just looked at her. Thank you for coming, she said. Her voice was quiet, not pleading, just tired. I'm here, he said. She nodded. She didn't waste the opening. I know what you've been building, she said. I don't know how much of it you've shared with counsel. I know you were subpoenaed. I know the federal inquiry is expanding to all 4 facilities. Marcus said nothing. I'm not asking you to lie, she continued. I'm not asking you to destroy your notes. I'm asking you to understand what happens when you hand them over. She reached into a leather folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a financial projection, conservative estimates, not optimistic. If the federal injunction hits, she said, the plant freezes, not for 6 weeks, indefinitely. Asset preservation order, account receivership. The pension fund is tied to company solvency. If the company goes into forced liquidation, the pension collapses. 800 people lose their jobs, not just the floor workers, the maintenance crews, the administrative staff, the contract workers who finally get pulled into the permanent pool, all of it. Marcus looked at the numbers. He didn't need to verify them. He knew the architecture of Meridian's balance sheet. He knew how thin the margin actually was. You're telling me this because you're worried about the pension, he said. I'm telling you this because I made a calculation, Evelyn said. And the calculation was wrong. She leaned forward slightly. The glass reflected the gray sky. Corporate gave us impossible targets. 18% margin improvement in a single fiscal year. On a plant this old, with this equipment, with these labor costs. I told them it wasn't achievable. I told them twice. They told me to find a way or find a replacement. She paused. I found a way. I'm not proud of every part of it, but 800 people are still employed because I found a way. Marcus watched her carefully. He wasn't looking for guilt. He was looking for the shape of the truth. You gambled on compliance shortcuts, he said. I gambled that I could close the gap before the audit caught it, she corrected. I gambled that the equipment would hold. I gambled that the contract labor structure would absorb the liability without anyone getting hurt. She stopped. Her jaw tightened. I lost every bet. The room was quiet, except for the half-act. You ordered me to falsify federal documentation, Marcus said. I ordered you to buy us time, she said. And when you refused, I found someone who would. That was my failure, not yours. She sat back. She didn't try to soften it. She didn't try to make it about loyalty or corporate culture or the weight of leadership. She just laid the architecture on the table and let him look at it. If you testify aggressively, she said, you get justice. The company collapses. The pensions vanish. The workers you've spent your career protecting lose everything they were counting on. If you testify strategically, you force regulatory oversight. You force structural reform. You keep the plant alive long enough for the pensions to vest. You don't get the clean victory, but you don't burn the floor out from under them either. Marcus looked at the financial projection. He looked at her. He thought about the corkboard in his war room, the index cards, the colored thread, the word insulation pinned in the center. He had spent 4 months building a case to expose a system. He hadn't fully considered that the system was holding up 800 roofs. I didn't come here to negotiate, Evelyn said quietly. I came here to make sure you understood the blast radius before you pulled the pin. She stood up. She didn't offer a handshake. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame, and said, You're not the villain in this story, Marcus, but you're not the only one trying to keep people employed either. She left. Marcus sat in the quiet room for a long time. The water in the pitcher had gone warm. The rain had stopped. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm. He picked up the financial projection. He folded it once. He put it in his coat pocket. He walked out of the building and into the damp afternoon air. He didn't go home immediately. He drove to the edge of the industrial park and parked on a service road overlooking the Meridian facility. The parking lot was half full. Shift change. Workers moving between cars and gates in steady, practiced lines. People who had mortgages. People who had kids in school. People who had texted him 3-word messages and trusted him to know what was right. He turned the engine off. He sat with his hands on the steering wheel and let the weight of the choice settle into his chest. He had always believed that truth was a clean line, that if you stood on it, you were safe, that if you compromised it, you were lost. But truth wasn't a line, it was a structure, and structures carried weight, and weight had consequences. He thought about Darnell Cooper's left forearm. He thought about the Georgia workers with chemical burns. He thought about the contract workers whose injuries didn't even appear on Meridian's OSHA logs. He thought about 800 families who would lose their retirement if he handed over everything exactly as he had documented it. There was no clean path. There was only a choice between two kinds of harm. He started the car and drove home. Lila was at the kitchen table when he walked in. She had a biology textbook open, a highlighter in her hand, and the particular stillness of a teenager who has been waiting for something without admitting it. She looked up. She read his face before he said a word. "You met with her," she said. "Yeah." "And?" Marcus took off his coat. He hung it on the back of a chair. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly, buying time he didn't have. "She told me what happens if I tell the whole truth," he said. Leela closed her textbook. She pushed it aside. She looked at him with the directness that always caught him off guard. "If telling the truth hurts people," she said, "is it still the right thing?" Marcus set the glass down. He looked at his daughter. He thought about giving her the careful answer, the one that sounded wise but meant nothing, the one that protected her from the weight he was carrying. He didn't. "I don't know yet," he said. Lila held his gaze for a long moment. She didn't push. She didn't offer advice. She just absorbed the honesty of it. "Okay," she said finally. She picked up her highlighter. "I'll be in my room if you need me." She left him alone in the kitchen. Marcus stood at the counter, the silence settling around him like dust. He thought about the subpoena. He thought about the recording. He thought about the corkboard and the words insulation, and the 800 roofs holding up against the sky. He walked to the war room. He sat at his desk. He pulled the yellow legal pad toward him. He didn't write 2 columns this time. He wrote one question. What does it cost to do the right thing when the right thing isn't clean? He stared at it until the words stopped looking like letters and started looking like a mirror. He didn't have an answer, but he knew he would have to choose before the hearing, and whatever he chose, he would have to carry it. Marcus called Sandra on a Sunday night. "I know what I'm going to do," he said. "Tell me." "I testify fully. Everything, the recording, the documentation, the labor assignment pattern, all of it." He paused. "But I want conditions. Before I hand over a single document, I want the pension fund ring-fenced under emergency court protection. I want a consent decree framework that allows restructuring rather than dissolution. And I want the corporate executives who set those margin targets named as parties to the inquiry. Not just Evelyn, the people above her." Sandra was quiet for a moment. The investigator's office doesn't typically negotiate pre-testimony conditions. "Then they'll get a witness who answers only what he's asked and nothing more," Marcus said. "Or they'll negotiate." She made the call in the morning. It took 11 days. The pension ring fence was approved. 2 senior corporate executives were added as subjects of the inquiry. The consent decree framework went forward. It wasn't everything Marcus had asked for. It was enough. The hearing room smelled like carpet cleaner and institutional coffee. Marcus sat at the witness table alone, Sandra directly behind him, in the same dark gray suit he wore to every serious moment of his adult life. He answered each question without notes, without theater, without the performance of outrage that the room seemed to be quietly expecting from him. When they asked about Evelyn's instruction to falsify compliance certifications, he described it plainly. When they walked him through the labor assignment data, the contract workers, the minority workforce distribution, the injury records that never appeared in Meridian's OSHA filings, he slowed down. The structure ensured that when equipment failed, and it failed predictably because the certification gaps made failure predictable, the liability flowed away from Meridian and toward the workers least equipped to redirect it. He paused. These were real people, not variables. When Representative Aldridge asked why he had waited months before bringing his documentation forward, Marcus looked at the table for a moment. "Because I needed to understand what the truth would cost before I decided how to hand it over," he said. 800 people work at that plant. I needed to know whether the way I testified would destroy them or protect them. And have you determined that? I've determined that I can tell the truth fully and still ask this committee to use it carefully. He looked up. "Integrity isn't about being clean," he said. "It's about being accountable when you weren't." Evelyn Grant resigned within 48 hours. The CFO followed. The pension fund, protected under the emergency court order, was preserved at 91 cents on the dollar. Not whole, but not gone. The plant stayed open under federal consent decree and independent compliance monitoring. The restructuring administrator called 3 weeks later with an offer: interim COO, significant compensation, a chance to fix everything from inside. Marcus said no. Instead, over the following months, he quietly contacted 11 displaced contract workers whose positions had been eliminated when the staffing agency lost its Meridian contract. He hired 4 directly. He connected 3 others with firms in his network. He didn't announce it. He just called people who needed work and told them he had work that needed doing. That evening, Lila looked up from her homework. "Is it done?" "The loud part," Marcus said. "The rest is quiet." She nodded. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped. "Dad, that thing you said at the hearing, someone clipped it. A lot of people shared it." Marcus looked at her. "As long as they understood what it cost." Lila smiled, just slightly. "I think some of them did." He stood alone in the kitchen after she went upstairs. He hadn't walked away clean. He had walked away deliberate. And when the moment came that made the walking away mean something, he hadn't run from it. Freedom isn't walking away. It's choosing what stays standing after you do.